They called her the Blood Countess. Elizabeth Báthory was accused of torturing and murdering young women inside her castles. Some accounts eventually claimed her victims numbered in the hundreds, and centuries later, an even more horrifying story emerged. Elizabeth Báthory bathed in the blood of young women to preserve her youth. There's just one problem. There is no reliable contemporary evidence that she ever bathed in blood. So how much of the story of the infamous Blood Countess is actually true? Was Elizabeth Báthory one of history's most terrifying female killers? Were some of the accusations against her exaggerated? Or did centuries of storytelling transform an already disturbing case into something even darker? More than 400 years later, historians are still trying to separate the woman from the legend. And that is exactly what we're going to try to do. Elizabeth Báthory's story certainly didn't begin like that of a future monster. She was born in August 1560 into one of the wealthiest and most powerful noble families in the Kingdom of Hungary. The Bathory family owned vast estates and had connections to some of the most influential figures in Central Europe. Members of the extended family became princes of Transylvania, and her cousin, Stephen Bathory, would become Prince of Transylvania and later King of Poland. Elizabeth was raised in privilege and received an education unusual for many women of her time. She learned languages and was reportedly highly intelligent and capable of managing the enormous estates that would eventually come under her control. The Bathory family was Protestant in a region divided by religious and political conflict, and Elizabeth was growing up in a dangerous part of Europe. The Kingdom of Hungary had been divided between competing powers, while warfare with the Ottoman Empire remained an ever-present reality. Violence was not something confined to frightening stories. It was part of the world around her. Later accounts would attempt to find signs in Elizabeth's childhood that might explain the woman she supposedly became. Stories emerged of illnesses, seizures, violent relatives, and even strange medical treatments involving blood. But many of these details are difficult to verify. The further we travel into her life, the harder it sometimes becomes to determine where documented history ends and the legend of the Blood Countess begins. Elizabeth's future had been decided while she was still a child. At around the age of 10, she was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, the son of another extremely powerful Hungarian noble family. As part of the arrangement, Elizabeth was sent to live with the Nadasdy family at Sávár Castle. Then, in 1575, at approximately 14 or 15 years old, Elizabeth married Ferenc, who was about 4 years older. Their wedding was an enormous affair, reportedly attended by thousands of guests. Elizabeth retained the Bathory name because her family's social standing was actually higher than her husband's. Over the years, Ferenc became a prominent military commander, spending long periods away fighting the Ottoman Empire, and that left Elizabeth with enormous responsibilities. While her husband was away, she helped manage the family's extensive estates, overseeing property, finances, servants, and the affairs of the people who lived on their lands. This was a woman accustomed to wealth, authority, and power. Elizabeth and Ferenc eventually had several children, although historical accounts differ over the exact number. Then, in 1604, Ferenc died after a period of declining health. Elizabeth was now a wealthy widow in her early 40s, and without her husband, she exercised even greater control over the family's enormous holdings. But by this time, disturbing rumours had begun to circulate. Young female servants were allegedly being beaten and tortured at Elizabeth's residences. Then came accusations that some of them had died. At first, many of the alleged victims were poor servant girls, but eventually the accusations became impossible for the authorities to ignore, and the numbers began to grow. Dozens, then scores. Later stories would claim hundreds of victims, and eventually one particularly gruesome legend would become inseparable from Elizabeth Báthory's name: that she murdered young virgins and bathed in their blood to remain young. But that famous story doesn't appear in the contemporary investigation. The blood-bathing legend came later. What the authorities were investigating in Elizabeth's own lifetime was already disturbing enough. In 1610, King Matthias II ordered an investigation into the accusations. The man placed in charge was Georg Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, one of the kingdom's most powerful officials, and someone with personal connections to the Bathory family. Investigators began gathering testimony. Eventually, statements were collected from hundreds of witnesses. But there was a problem. Much of what those witnesses described was not something they had personally seen. Some repeated stories they had heard from other people. Others claimed direct knowledge of abused or dead girls. And several of Elizabeth's own servants would eventually be accused of participating in the violence. Then, on December 29th, 1610, Thurzo went to Chester Castle, today known as Chuktica Castle in Slovakia. Elizabeth Báthory's freedom was about to come to an end, but the question that has followed her for more than 4 centuries was only beginning. What had they actually discovered inside the castle, and how much of the horrifying story that followed can we prove? Elizabeth Báthory was never given the kind of public trial we might expect for someone accused of such extraordinary crimes. And that would become one of the greatest controversies surrounding her story. Several of her alleged accomplices were interrogated, prosecuted, and convicted. Some were tortured during the investigation. Several were executed. But Elizabeth herself? She never faced a full public trial. Her enormous social status and the political consequences of publicly prosecuting one of Hungary's most powerful noblewomen almost certainly complicated the situation. Instead, Elizabeth was confined at Chester Castle, and she would never leave. Later stories claimed she was literally walled inside a small set of rooms, with only openings left for food. The reality appears to have been less theatrical, but she was nevertheless kept under confinement for the remainder of her life. And this is where another mystery enters the story. King Matthias II owed a substantial financial debt connected to Elizabeth and her family. Elizabeth also controlled enormous wealth and valuable estates. Those facts have led some modern writers to argue that powerful men had financial and political reasons for wanting her removed. Was the investigation partly a scheme to take control of her fortune? Possibly. But financial motives alone don't prove that the accusations against her were false. And despite later conspiracy theories, her family retained much of its property. That's what makes the Bathory case so difficult. There was testimony from hundreds of people. There were accusations from servants and local witnesses. There were repeated stories of young women being brutally mistreated, but much of the testimony was second-hand. Elizabeth herself was never permitted to defend herself in a full public trial, and some of the most horrifying details associated with her today didn't appear until much later. The famous claim that she bathed in the blood of virgins to remain young, that story emerged long after Elizabeth was dead. The claim that she murdered 650 young women. A witness reportedly referred to an enormous number supposedly recorded in a register, but no such register survives. Elizabeth remained confined at Chester Castle until her death on August 21st, 1614, at approximately 54 years old. She was initially buried locally, although the location of her remains today is uncertain. But Elizabeth Báthory didn't disappear into history. Instead, she became a legend. The wealthy Hungarian countess became the infamous Blood Countess. Stories about torture, murdered virgins, and blood eventually transformed her into an almost supernatural monster. She has appeared in books, films, and countless works of fiction, and her legend has frequently been connected with vampire mythology. More than 4 centuries later, historians still debate exactly what happened. Was Elizabeth Báthory responsible for the torture and deaths of numerous young women? Were genuine crimes dramatically exaggerated over time? Or was a powerful and wealthy widow destroyed, at least in part, by political enemies and a case built heavily upon questionable testimony? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the truth lies somewhere in between. Elizabeth Báthory may not have been the blood-bathing monster of legend, but that doesn't necessarily mean she was innocent. And without a trial, without the alleged register of victims, and with legend layered upon legend for more than 400 years, we may never know the full truth. So what do you think? Was Elizabeth Báthory truly the Blood Countess? Or did history turn a powerful woman into a monster? Let me know what you think in the comments.